Okay, so now we're at the last slide of our analysis of Beveridge's speech. And here he says, Mr. President, this question is deeper than any question of party politics, deeper than any question of the isolated policy of our country even. Notice here he's referring to isolationism, right? Which is, again, the debate in our country. Deeper even than any question of constitutional power. It is elemental. It is racial. Okay, so here I want to stop and say that, hey, it transcends all these issues, political issues, isolationism, foreign policy, the Constitution. What matters most, according to Beveridge, or what he calls elemental, what is elemental, what is fundamental in this debate is race. Okay, it is racial. So take note of that. I want to make sure that you understand that Beveridge is emphasizing race first and foremost among all other factors. Now, race here cannot be really extricated from civilizing mission or cultural reasons, okay? Because race, the American race or Anglo-Saxons, are, again, the standard bearers of democracy and so on, and they are the ones responsible for bringing freedom and democracy to the backwards people, right? So that's the connection. Okay, but he says, God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration. No. So he's saying here, Teutonic peoples, by the way, refers to Germanic-speaking people in, Northern Europe. And he's basically arguing that the English-speaking, along with the Teutonic peoples, they've been basically for thousands of years preparing to eventually understand and create and even master the art of democracy, right? And just because they are the chosen race by God, well, they just can't sit and admire themselves, right? This is not what God has been preparing them to do. So he goes on and says, He has made us the master organizers of the world to establish a system where chaos reigns. He has given us the spirit of progress to overwhelm the forces of reaction throughout the earth. He has made us adept in government that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night. And of all our race, he has marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world. This is the divine mission of America. We could call it, a civilizing mission, right? Connected religion. This is the divine mission of America, and it holds for us all the profit, all the glory, all the happiness possible to man. We are trustees of the world's progress, guardians of its righteous peace. The judgment of the master is upon us. Quote, ye have been faithful over a few things. I will make you rule over many things. So he's quoting the Bible to justify this. Okay, so again, the rest of this is really talking about how the world mostly consists of, savagery, of backwards people. And therefore, it's the responsibility, God-given responsibility to spread the art of government, and to be specific, democracy, right? What he calls, here, to administer government among savage and senile people. And he says here, this is a burden, again, right, to use that term. But if it wasn't for us, the rest of the world would relapse or retreat into barbarism, into night, right? And would lead to regeneration, lead to chaos. And therefore, God has chosen us to do this. So, again, the Philippines is seen as a crucial step in this goal of regeneration of the world. Notice that the scope of Beveridge goes way beyond earthly matters, right? That it transcends these mundane issues, economic issues, and therefore serves as a very effective justificatory framework to convince and persuade Americans to actually undertake the goal, right, to pursue the goal of overseas imperialism and colonization. Okay, so previously I mentioned that the United States considered itself as an extension of Anglo-Saxon civilization or English civilization. And at this time, the English Empire was the mightiest empire in the world. They called the English Empire, quote, the empire where the sun never sets, unquote, because it held overseas territories throughout the world. And as I also described earlier, your greatness as an empire was directly measured by the extent of your overseas possessions. So the English Empire was the greatest. And here's this English poet looking at what's happening with America, noticing that it was bending towards, overseas imperialism in its foreign policy. And therefore, he writes this poem called The White Man's Burden. And notice the term white man. Today we think of persons of European descent, but here he's really talking about Anglo-Saxons, right? The English race. And that includes the American race back then. So also notice that he includes the term burden as we described, that this is a task, right? It's not an easy task. We're going to be inconvenienced by this burden, but we should do it. We are God's chosen people, and therefore it's our moral responsibility to spread civilization. And again, this is civilizing mission, right? And of course, that's tied to race because you're civilizing the savages. Okay, so here was a poem written by Rudyard Kipling, a very famous poet back then. And here he's urging America to follow the example of the British in the civilizing mission. Now, you may have heard of Rudyard Kipling. Probably his most famous work is The Jungle Book. And if you know anything about The Jungle Book, there's a character named Mowgli. And what is Mowgli? He's basically a native, right? In other words, he's what you'd call, what Beveridge called barbaric, right? The barbarous people, right? And even when you think of Mowgli, he's dark-skinned and scantily dressed like a native, like a savage, so to speak, right? So it makes sense that this would be a character in one of Rudyard Kipling's work. But as noted here, it says, in February 1899, the British novelist and poet Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem entitled White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands. In this poem, Kipling urged the U.S. to take the burden of empire. Okay. All right, so let's look very briefly. We don't have to read the whole thing, but here you're going to see imagery in, form of poetry that basically echoes that of Senator Beveridge. It says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go send your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child." So it's a burden, but we have to do it because we are trustees of God, to use Beveridge's term, and we need to send forth the best of our country, right? The best Americans. Send them abroad and to serve your captives. And in this context, the Filipinos, right? They are your new caught peoples. They're half devil and half child. Okay, so clearly inferiorization in this racialization of Filipinos seen as less than human, right? In fact, half devil, interestingly enough. Going on, take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, and 100 times made plain, to seek another profits and work another's gain, and so on and so forth. It's basically a reiteration of what he's saying in the beginning, right? That this is a burden. We have to be patient. There's going to be a threat of terror, but at the same time, we have to, not be too prideful, right? And basically, it's a burden again. I keep saying that, but this is part of that civilizing mission, right? That the United States and Great Britain, who really felt, the country of Great Britain, or the empire, felt they were the ones that were leading this effort, right? And America was following in its footsteps in the civilizing mission. But again, when you look at this poetry, it's clearly apparent that it's just full of racialization, full of racial hierarchies, right? And you put that together with civilizing mission, and it gives you a good picture as to why many Americans, and of course the English, felt justified in their overseas colonization and their control and domination of those persons of color abroad. Now, if you recall at the beginning of this part of the lecture, I mentioned that there was a significant faction of Americans that oppose colonization of the Philippines. Okay, so the luminaries that were part of this opposition, they called themselves the Anti-Imperialist League. And it was indeed an influential and quite powerful league. Why am I saying this? Because it was constituted by well-known Americans at this time. Mark Twain, the most well-known literary figure in the United States at that time. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was, of course, a famous African-American, very controversial one back then, African-American historian and academic. Andrew Carnegie, right, a famous captain of industry. Jane Addams, who was a well-known progressivist activist, basically helped immigrants and helped them with assimilation and so forth. Samuel Gompers, who was a union leader. And then you had this Senator George Boutwell, who was prominent back then. Now, their main objection against imperialism was exactly for ideological reasons. It was against the grain of American democracy and traditional isolationism. But it's important to note this. There were some, very few, marginal, right, number of imperialists who objected to the colonization of the Philippines on the grounds of race, for racial reasons. Why was this? Well, for them, they oppose it because understanding that there's no prior historical experience in our country with overseas colonization, right, that there's no precedent that we could work with, the possibility existed that we may have to provide citizenship for these Filipino natives once we claim that area, right? So it meant extending U.S. citizenship to millions. Remember, I mentioned it could be up to 10 million Filipinos at that time. Now, this was incomprehensible to most Americans, the possibility of extending U.S. citizenship to persons of color. Now, in the United States, you did have it extended to African Americans by 1869 with the 14th Amendment. But going overseas and extending it to a colony comprised of, millions was something that was outside the purview of, a possibility, right, for most Americans, okay? And also the possibility that, hey, these migrants or these Filipino subjects might actually migrate to the U.S. mainland. And indeed, it would occur, though not in super large numbers, but we'll discuss that very shortly in this lecture.